Today, I want to talk about making reads in Flesh and Blood. I feel like for the first maybe like 6 months of playing, I really thought that Flesh and Blood was a numbers game where you kind of just compared hands with your opponent, and then over 10 turns, one of you had more value in your hands than the other, and eventually one person lost. Well, I really think Flesh and Blood is not that sort of game now. I think Flesh and Blood is really read-based at the moment, and you can get a lot of value when you play against somebody by understanding how they want to block and how they've blocked so far in a turn, and maybe what they've arsenaled and what they attacked with last turn. I have Censor on the screen because I think Censor is a card that really takes advantage of understanding your opponent's game plan, your game plan, and how your opponent has acted throughout the game. The first main thing to realize about making reads is that your opponent is a rational actor. Your opponent is a person, and a person will be making decisions about how to play their cards. If your opponent was not a person, maybe making reads would be harder, but your opponent is constantly making decisions about what they value in a game of Flesh and Blood. If your opponent is blocking with a lot of attacks and making sure to always block every single on-hit, and then they suddenly don't block, well, maybe you can find out something about their hand. Or maybe if your opponent usually likes to keep all their hands and attack with a bunch of stuff, and then your opponent blocks with some higher value cards and then arsenals a specific card, you can make a read about what they've put in their arsenal. For example, if you're playing against Aurora and your Aurora opponent has mostly been attacking with their 0/4s with Go Again and giving stuff Go Again with a blue maybe once every other turn. If that opponent suddenly decides, okay, I'm just going to block 8 on a single attack with a 2-block and 2 3-blocks, and then arsenal a card, well, it might be kind of easy to figure out what that card is. If they're valuing that card much higher than all the other cards in their deck by arsenaling it and blocking with everything else, that means that card is probably Arc Lightning, or something of similar power level in a different deck. For Enigma, if they mostly are playing 2-card 6s or 2-card 8s, and then suddenly they just block 9 and arsenal a card, well, you can be pretty sure that card is a mirror guy, because they really wouldn't be prioritizing any other cards in that sort of way. Sometimes your opponent makes a decision and you make a read and it's wrong. Well, how can we prepare for when we make a read that is slightly incorrect on our opponent? What you want to do when making reads is prioritize high floor, high ceiling plays. What does this mean? Well, Command and Conquer is the best example. If we make a read that our opponent has arsenaled a specific card on a specific turn, and we play out a Command and Conquer, and they don't block it, they say no blocks, take 6, and they lose a card that maybe was worth 3 value instead of something that was worth higher value, well, we still did gain quite a bit of value from that Command and Conquer. It was still a 2-card 9 in that situation. If we hit in that situation, well, suddenly our Command and Conquer has gone from being a 2-card 9 to being a 2-card, who knows, maybe that card in their arsenal was an Arc Lightning and it's worth like 8 damage. And so maybe we turned our 2-card 9 into a 2-card 14. We can look at some other examples where the floor might be lower. If you play a Weakest Link into -IO, sometimes they have no items in hand, and they say no blocks, and then they send 5 cards at you and you die. If you can make a decision between sending a Command and Conquer and a Weakest Link, oftentimes you would want to send the Command and Conquer because you get a card out of their arsenal in the worst case that is just kind of whatever. And in that case, you just got a 2-card 9, but then in the best case, they have a bunch of no blocks in hand, and you hit them with Command and Conquer, and they lose their maximum velocity in arsenal, which was worth like maybe 6 or 7 value, and so it's a pretty good turn. But if somehow you were able to get a read that they had an item in hand and they wouldn't be able to block the Weakest Link out, well, maybe playing Weakest Link is pretty good in that scenario. But if you make that read and then attack with Weakest Link and your opponent just lets it hit and nothing happens, then you get super punished. So what does that mean about how we should be making plays in Flesh and Blood? It means that we should prioritize reads that have a high floor for when they resolve and a high ceiling So if our floor is our opponent blocks with 2 cards or just lets their arsenal die, and our ceiling is we kill our opponent's best card in their deck and they basically can't win anymore, well, that's a great play. If our floor is do nothing, basically just deal 6 with no on hit, and our ceiling is still high, well, maybe we want to prioritize that play less of the time. That was my video about trying to make reads in Flesh and Blood. I'm going to be making something of a series of slightly more advanced topics in Flesh and Blood and how to apply them in your games. So like and subscribe if you want to see more.